Hello, welcome to part 2 of the video series on political participation and public opinion. We are going to start with the slide that you see in front of you. So I'm going to say goodbye once again. Hello, happy holidays, and disappear. All right, political participation. One thing you see, first came voter apathy, then candidate apathy, coming soon. Why don't we just have a king? Isn't that sad? I think it's sad, but we've got to be able to participate in politics in order to make a difference in society. So you all are the game changers. So with that said, let's go on to the next slide. Political participation really is just how we participate. I gave you a little glimpse of that with Journeys with George. So let's look at all of the ways people participate in campaigns. So the number one thing, and I've highlighted here, is voting. People also protest. I think we've seen that that can be a huge game changer. If you look at the Ferguson, Missouri police riots that occurred several months ago, as well as waiting on the grand jury, I think you have a heightened sense of awareness when people participate and stage protests. Another form, though, is civil disobedience. We saw this very evident as an effective form of participation, such as the sit-in in Greensboro when the young gentleman sat at the Woolworths counter and refused to leave unless they were served. Rosa Parks riding at the front of the bus. Martin Luther King Jr. leading his peaceful protest as well. Those are forms of civil disobedience that definitely left a mark on society. We can also sign a petition to encourage something to get on the ballot or to maybe make a change in an existing law. You can work on a campaign. You can answer phones. You can call people. You can volunteer to drive people to the polls. You can work at a polling booth. Some of you have done that. You can write letters to community leaders and state and federal leaders as well. And you can simply volunteer in any agency or any organization that needs volunteers to work with kids, spending time with others to make society a better place. That is participating in politics. But the number one way, of course, is simply by voting. Now, we do have non-voters, and we look at and analyze ways people don't vote. So U.S. has a lower turnout than Europeans, which is sort of interesting, but some countries, such as Australia, for example, has mandatory voting, where if you do not show up at the polls on election day, you are fined, and it can be anywhere from $50 to $100. So you have to ask yourself, is mandatory voting a better way of operating a democracy? Or should we vote by choice and have lower voter turnout? Some people think in America maybe we need to have it mandatory. Others say leave it alone and let those who choose to go vote, vote. So that's food for thought for you to think about. Different terms that come up when we talk about voting in particular. The voting age population, VAP, you might see that at some point. The voting age population is simply all of those who are 18 years and older. Then you have registered voters within the voting age population, those 18 and up who are registered to vote. And those numbers can tend to vary by 40% because we might have people registered to vote, but we don't have all 18-year-old and older registered to vote. This is a very interesting chart, and I'll give you a second to process this or pause it so you can really look at it. It says change in voter turnout over time following 5 different countries. And it starts in 1960 and continues to 2005 on this general trend. America, if I said identify a trend in this map, what would you say about America? I would tend to say that there was a dip in voter participation or a decline in 1960. Here it begins the era of mistrust when Nixon resigned. Look at that. In the 80s, lower voter turnout participation. But then we have a spike here. So you have to think, why in 1992 did we have a turnout? Well, this is when George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton was one of the youngest candidates to campaign, and he brought a certain charisma to the campaign trail, and a lot of younger voters turned out to vote. But we saw a dip here, so that's interesting that there was that big of a contrast, and then it increased again. But what big event happened right here? This is 9/11, and then we had the war in Iraq here between 2000 and 2004, so more people turned out to vote to give their opinion. Look at India. They have quite a variety. I think this red one, Japan, in their general election, look how it has decreased over time if you drop from point A to point B. In Great Britain, sort of the same trend, constant overall from here to here, but then a drastic dip. And again, 9/11, but it had an adverse effect rather than if you compare it to American politics. But look at this one. Why are German federal elections? That is an incredibly high rate. If you look at a constant here, why does Germany turn out to vote? So that might be a question to consider. So why don't people go vote? Why is voter turnout low? The number one reason is voter apathy. A lot of people don't care. They would rather listen to music, they'd rather watch Netflix and YouTube videos and pop culture. And they don't really care. They don't think their vote makes a difference. So that is called voter apathy. They don't want to vote on election day. They don't know who the candidates are. They don't take the time to participate in their community to make a difference. And that's called voter apathy. They just don't care. Another reason, some people don't know how to register, and there aren't registration drives. Like, think of how we register to vote in class. Some people don't take the time to go down to the courthouse, or when they renew their driver's license, some people don't have driver's license and they just don't know how to register to vote and don't take the time to go look. So you have to ask yourself, how do we increase voting? And really, do you want to increase voting? And if we do, what are we going to do about it? So what has happened in the last 20 or so years, they've had get out the vote drives. And by they, I mean states have had this, political parties have had it, college communities have had get out the vote drives, local League of Women Voters have had get out the vote drives. And in 1993, President Clinton signed into law the Motor Voter Law. And this has had a pretty dramatic impact on registering to vote. When you go get your driver's license when you're 18 or older, like when I go renew mine in a couple years, they will say, are you registered to vote? And if you aren't, would you like to register? And by a click of the button there, I would be registered to vote. So the Motor Voter Law, by combining driver's license as well as signing up and registering to vote, it has had a huge impact. Registration takes effort in the United States. In Europe, it is automatic when you are born and you sign up with their equivalent of a social security card. When you turn the legal age to vote, you're automatically registered. And maybe that's something the United States should look into. Verba and Nye studied voter participation and just political participation overall, and they looked at 6 different ways people participate in communities. Voting, of course, was the most common. And I'm going to show these in clumps here, and then there's a visual on the next slide as well. But some people they classified as inactive. These are people who rarely vote, and they're just not involved at all in society. And that makes up about 1 out of every 5 people just do not care and don't do anything. Then you have voting specialists. Those are people who only vote. I'll vote, I won't miss a vote, but I'm not going to volunteer, I'm not going to do anything else in my community. The next level, they're called campaigners. These are people who vote, they get involved in a campaign. Some of you might have marched in parades. They follow the results. They tend to be better educated, and they know who they want to vote for. They have a stronger party identification. And you'll see the stronger your party ID, the more likely you're probably involved in supporting your community and voting. The next one is called a communalist. These are people who like to volunteer in their community. They may not follow politics, but they are involved on local boards. They volunteer maybe with their churches. They are active people in their society, and they do a lot of nonpartisan. Nonpartisan means it's not affiliated with either party. So they might work in a food kitchen and just say, I feel it is my responsibility in society to give back, so I want to volunteer. Or they might host a coat drive, or they might do the shoebox to donate to kids at Christmas. So those are ideas that of people who, it's not necessarily political for a candidate, but they do participate. Then you have parochial participants. These are people who do not vote, but they want to complain. That's a tough one. This isn't parochial as in church. This is just parochial as in the common person who doesn't want to take the time to vote or pay attention, but by golly, they will definitely tell you when something is wrong. They will write letters to the editor. They'll complain the loudest. They're the squeaky wheels, and they don't want to do anything else to be positive except complain. And then you have the last one, complete activists. They're just overall, they are involved in their community. They like to help with community service. They vote, they get out. So this is sort of how they've classified people after studying hundreds and thousands of participants over a period of time. These are the labels that they came up with on forms of participation. So Verba and Knight's a pretty famous research study that they did several years ago. So let's look at the last couple things. These are voting turnout. There's a debate over why we're declining and why people are not turning out to vote. Some people say it's just based on interest and party competition, that when the party, and the trend here is that political parties are losing their stronghold on the population, and we have more independents and swing voters. So as party competition decreases, people don't care as much. Also, people are discouraged because ballot counting isn't as honest as it used to be, and it's leading to decreased interest. Parties once printed their own ballots, which led to some illegal practices because they would stuff the ballot box. Ballots were cast in public, so people were intimidated. And so what we've done overall is that we have gone to what we call the Australian ballot, and the Australian ballot lets you vote in private, and the public pays for the ballot. All candidates' names are listed, and it's cast in secret. And so that is what we have adopted for all federal elections, are those four things that really have helped make it much more fair and making ballot counting a little more honest. Real decline, however, could be due to several causes. Again, I go back to registration. Every state has, remember, federal can step in a little bit, but states clarify requirements. And so you might have residency in one state is not needed, and then another state you have to be there 30 days, and another state you have to be there 60 days. There are states that still might discriminate or have in the past against certain citizens, making it more difficult. So this can be a factor. Also, when you compare us nationwide, like I just showed you earlier, voting is compulsory in other nations, and it's not so here. So how can voting decline when more people are eligible? We have more people in our population, so why aren't people voting? And that tends to be a real difficult issue for a lot of candidates when they try to appeal in a variety of ways to so many different people. So on the flip side of that, when we look at why people don't vote, let's look at why people do vote. Those with schooling or political information are more likely to vote. These are trends. Churchgoers are more likely to vote. So you can see two different areas there where they can target people specifically because they know they are the ones that are going to make the difference in voting. Men and women vote at the same rate. They tend to both vote out in equal amounts, or show up rather in equal amounts. On the issue of race, African Americans tend to have a lower participation rate than whites, although they were at an all-time high in the 2008 election, not as much in the 2012. You look at mistrust in government and how people don't trust their government. They've seen not a real clear correlation that if you hate the government, you're more likely to vote or not likely to vote. So even though that's a factor in people and what they think, the psychological impact of voting, still people will go vote and turn up at the polls. Another one, there's difficulty of registration, and we've already talked about that. We call these barriers to voting, and there is a difficulty in that, and that can hinder voters. Americans tend to vote less, but participate more in community compared to other European societies. I think that's an interesting phrase if you think about that. We vote less, but we participate more and help people more with charities. Americans, and this is called the decentralization, Americans elect more officials than Europeans do, and we have a higher rate of elections, which could impact the voter turnout. Like, this is just another election. I just voted a couple months ago. I don't really know who's running, so I'm not going to show up to vote. We have federal offices in many different areas. We have state offices. We have local offices. We have county offices, and we have city offices. That's a lot of elections to know and different officials on every single race. I said this a minute ago. Parties are decentralized, but they have many areas where people can participate and get involved. And this is what I just showed you again, that verba and nigh, the levels of participation. That's just a visual to help come back to that point and how people can participate. So the last thing I want to go over here in political participation is a huge topic, and I want you to highlight this because these are barriers to voting. Why aren't people voting? Sometimes it's psychological that people choose not to, but other times it's the federal or state rules that are in place that hinder people from voting. There are impediments to registration. Sometimes parties don't do effective get out to vote drives. And then we have these terms like cannot voters. Sometimes cannot voters are resident aliens. They live here in the United States, but they're not a citizen, so therefore they cannot vote. A felon loses the right to vote as long as they're still classified a felon. Once they have served on parole effectively and parole is up, then it lifts their felon status and they can vote in elections. Sometimes people are in the hospital. They might be in the ICU. They cannot vote. Physically, they cannot vote. Sometimes people are traveling and not at their precinct and forgot to get their absentee ballot. Therefore, they cannot vote. Some people believe, and there are some religions that treat voting as a form of idolatry, and therefore their religion forbids them from voting. So those are called cannot voters. That's a little term that you should be familiar with. Then we have non-voters. A non-voter is different from a cannot voter. A non-voter can vote, but they're choosing not to. So these are examples like, I forgot, it's too cold, I don't care, my vote's not going to count, oh, I was at work, oh, I'm out of town, oh, I want to go to this game instead of voting, I don't really want to drive clear over to my precinct. I can't find my precinct, I drove around the neighborhood, I don't know what to do, oh no. Those are non-voters, people who can and choose not to. Then we have voting procedures. I can't find my precinct, like I said with non-voters. I don't know what's on the ballot, or there are no ballots, or we ran out of ballots, or the line is so long, voting ended at 7 and I'm still in line and now I can't vote. Or I cannot read the ballot. I can't read the words on it, so there are language barriers. This is an interesting discussion too. The weather is a huge factor. If it is icy, guess who doesn't go vote? The elderly. If it is a beautiful day and it's sunny outside, people are happier, they're in a better mood to vote, so they all go out with a better attitude and tend to vote more positively. If it is a cold, dreary, rainy day, people are more negative. Isn't that interesting? And they tend to not want to vote as much. We also have what's called time zone fallout. I've mentioned this before, where polls close on the East Coast, and then on every hour, usually it's 7, they close. So polls can be closed for several hours on the East Coast, and the West Coast polls are still open. But now they're seeing the results on the East Coast, and they're like, oh, so-and-so is going to win. I'm just not going to go vote now because the election's almost over. That's called time zone fallout. Another interesting statistic with voting is that some voters get what we call ballot fatigue. This is particularly relevant on presidential elections because the ballot is so long. I think this is fascinating. The ballot is so long, people get tired voting. And they say, are you saying I have to vote on the front and on the back? This is just way too much. I don't know all these issues. So they might vote for president, governor, senator, and say, I'm done. So ballot fatigue is a barrier to voting. The last ones, apathy. We've talked about that. I don't care. No interest. Don't care again. Apathy. No sense of political efficacy. I want you to know this word. This pops up a lot, and I'll mention this again. Political efficacy defined is, do I think my vote is going to make a difference? If you have a low sense of political efficacy, then that means you don't think it matters if you vote. But if you have a high sense of political efficacy, it means what you decide in the ballot box definitely is going to impact the future. So we talk about political efficacy in terms of high and low. Is it going to matter or is it not? And that goes with psychological effects of voting as well. Political efficacy defined again, internal efficacy, which is the ability to understand and take part in politics. External efficacy, the ability to make the system respond. If I vote, do I really think it's going to change government? Is it worth it to vote? Are things just going to be the same? And so we refer to this, and the more you get into political science, the more that you study a sense of political efficacy. These three up here we've talked about before, ways for voters to be involved with popular initiative, getting something on the ballot, popular referendum, either removing a law or voting on a law passed by the legislature. It goes back to the voters, and a recall election, such as what they tried to do with Walker up in Wisconsin when he was in office, and they tried to kick him out by a recall election, but it didn't work. So the last thing here, the electoral process, this is how states used to have complete control of elections, but the federal government slowly has taken on more and more control. So here are ways the federal government has stepped in and regulated federal elections. So again, please know this, most election law is state law. States make elections, but the federal government stepped in and decided to help control it for better results. So for example, Congress, our federal Congress, has passed laws to regulate elections over time. In 1842, every member of the House of Representatives was now assigned a district. And so now, for example, Sam Graves is from the 6th District of Missouri. Out of our 8, we are defined there. It's called a single member district that we are elected to. Look at all the amendments that have dealt with voting. It helps regulate and remove barriers to prevent people from voting. The 15th Amendment said you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your race. The 19th Amendment gave suffrage, and this word is the right to vote. You need to know that term. Suffrage to women. 26 gave it to 18 to 20-year-olds. 17th Amendment, it used to be that the legislature was going to decide, and they removed that and said, no, we want the people to decide, U.S. senators. The 23rd Amendment gave electors in the Electoral College to the District of Columbia, because at that time only states could do it. Also, this little formula, federal election date, every federal election will be on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of even-numbered years. That's when we vote for Congress. That's when we vote for the president. Every 4 years is a presidential election. It's called an on-year election. And every other 2 years is an off year when we only elect Congress members. What I've done with some of these areas, and the AP tests love these, how have blacks improved, or African Americans improved their voting rights over time? The 15th Amendment I just mentioned was a huge part of helping African Americans achieve the right to vote. But what southern states tried to do prior to this was stop blacks from voting. They mandated a literacy test that you had to prove that you could read before you voted. They had a poll tax, which charged people in voting, and we removed that with the 24th Amendment. They had white primaries that said only white people could vote. They had grandfather clauses that said, well, if your grandfather could vote, then you can vote too. But if that wasn't the case, then you can't vote. They intimidated black voters at the polls. And so the southern states were regulated by that and proven to be unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Another massive step for voting rights was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This is huge. It gave the Office of the U.S. Attorney General the power to replace local agents with federal agents to ensure fair voting and no voter intimidation. It abolished all literacy tests, and it simplified the voter registration process to where people were going down to help blacks register to vote, or those of any race who had race as a barrier to voting. This is an excellent example of voting rights over time. Whites taking the escalator straight up to vote, no barriers. African Americans voting booth this way, pass the first hurdle, you have to prove to me you can read. Intimidation through local sheriffs and local registrars, jumping over the poll tax and paying a fee. The KKK, again intimidation, jumping the grandfather clause, and these are all hoops, and then you can vote. So the path has been a long one for different minority groups over time, and the federal government has tried to remove those barriers. You can also look at women's rights to vote and youth rights to vote. Western states permitted women to vote, like Montana, earlier than the 19th Amendment even, but the 19th Amendment gave overall suffrage to women. The youth vote by the Voting Rights Act of 1970, because individuals were serving, 18-year-olds were going to Vietnam, and also the 26th Amendment ratified in 71. It didn't have the impact. This was really interesting, but it didn't increase voter turnout like they would thought, but it did over time help the shift, but it didn't have a direct impact right away. So that ends voter participation. I hope that you learned a little bit about why people participate, why they do not participate, and influences and barriers concerning voting.